Hi everyone, Elliot here, just quickly hijacking the parish's YouTube channel. We've just come to the end of our Ezra-Nehemiah sermon series across the whole parish, so I thought it might be fun to do a quick video to summarise the 10 weeks of teaching that we've had and possibly what God might be speaking to us about as we enter this next phase of church in Drumfield. So just a quick reminder that the reason why we did this sermon series is that I felt God was really speaking to me about the people of Israel coming back from exile, which is the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, and how the church perhaps has been through a similar situation with the pandemic. We've been unable to meet together, we've been taken apart from one another, and now we're coming back together and we're metaphorically perhaps rebuilding church in a similar way to how Ezra and Nehemiah were rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple. So we're trying to understand what exactly does it mean to rebuild church in 2022 after this pandemic, after this exile that we've been through. So week 1, all the way back at the start of September, we were looking at Ezra chapters 1 to 3. And we did a recap of the whole of the Old Testament history to find exactly where the book of Ezra and Nehemiah fell. Remember that Ezra and Nehemiah was one book in the Hebrew Bible. It's now been separated into 2 books in the English Bibles, but it's still one story. So we had a look back at the story of Abraham and the promised land being given to him in Genesis 15, and then through the slavery in Egypt and the exodus out of that slavery heading towards the promised land. And even before they entered the promised land, God said to them in Leviticus 18 that if you continue to act the way that the pagan nations had acted in that land, the land itself would vomit you out. There's a very vivid word there that kind of shows how perhaps the land had been poisoned by the people there, and if Israel continued in that way, then the land would vomit them out as well. And the book of Ezra and Nehemiah has lots of Old Testament references, particularly to the temple and the kingship of David and Solomon in the first temple history. And we looked at the dedication of Solomon's temple when the smoke filled the temple, the smoke of the Lord, to the point where people were so overcome with the presence of God that they were unable to do their duties. And when we're looking at the story of them rebuilding the temple and building the second temple, and we didn't get that same sense, and that's just an interesting dynamic there. And then the prophets Amos and people like that who essentially acknowledged Israel's guilt and sinfulness and said, God is going to take you from this land. The land is going to vomit you out in the way that you had been warned all those years before. And ultimately that's what happened, and the nations of Assyria and then Babylon took the people away from their home, from Jerusalem. And then Persia came into power and allowed the people to come back. And this was one of the main points that we drew from the first sermon that week. That essentially the prophet of Ezra chapter 1 is someone that you wouldn't really expect it to be. It was Cyrus, the king of Persia, the king of the enemies, as it were. That was the person that God spoke to and said, allow my people to go back, and not only allow them, but encourage them and equip them to do so. So Ezra and a team of people eventually came back, but the temple itself was mainly headed up by Zerubbabel and a team of leaders at that time. And they rebuilt the temple, and all was good, except there was a lot of division. People who had remained in the land that didn't go off into exile wanted to help with that rebuild, and Zerubbabel said basically, no, this is only for the people who had been exiled to come back and rebuild. So even from pretty much day 1 there was division in the land, and division among who was allowed to build this temple, and essentially who this temple was for. And that dynamic of division and argument probably continues throughout the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So one of the messages then from that first week for us is, what does it really mean to have a fresh start? Is there even such a thing as a fresh start? I think this new temple rebuild is a new temple, it's a new beginning, but the people of Israel were people that had a history, they had an original temple. The exile only took possibly 70 years or so. So there are people of that generation before the exile who saw the original temple and saw the new temple and wept because it didn't have that same glory that the original temple did. It's much smaller, much more humble. They didn't have that same status that they had back then. So for us, what does that really mean to have a fresh start? We'll be exploring that as the series goes on. So on to week 2, we started looking at Ezra chapter 4 to 6. And this was the Sunday just after the Queen had died, if you remember. And so this question of a united kingdom, and the United Kingdom referring to Israel in its origins, as well as Great Britain now. And is the kingdom really united? Well, we saw from the Old Testament history that wasn't really the case anyway, that they only had 3 kings, Saul and David and Solomon, that had a united kingdom of Israel before the people divided and argued, and it split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And one thing that we really marvelled about the Queen is that she really knew how to hold this kingdom together, a united kingdom, that through all the political divisions and everything that's gone on through the 70 years of her reign, that she managed to keep us united. But that unity is not something that happened when Ezra and Nehemiah came back to rebuild that temple, or when Zerubbabel came to lead that rebuild rather. And we saw that the people who had remained in the land and the people who were coming back from exile bickered and argued about whose job it was to rebuild. And I think that for us that has a real lesson of how important unity is. And God is not a God of division but of unity, and that we as a church, through all our different denominations and different ways of worshipping and different theologies, actually we can still hold ourselves together as one church, one religion, one Christianity, that we don't get divided by that. And that's a real important lesson. And perhaps God not returning to the temple in the way that he did Solomon's temple in the first instance is perhaps symbolic of the fact that the people were not unified. They were not a unified kingdom like they should have been, like God called them to be even from day one. So moving on to week 3, we were looking at Ezra chapters 7 and 8 at that point, and this is really the story of Ezra himself coming back to Jerusalem. And we had a bit of a history of who Ezra was. He's described as a teacher of the law and someone who had put it on his heart to teach the law and to understand the scriptures. And within those couple of chapters, it explains how much Ezra was blessed by God and how much favour he had with God. He uses that word favour quite a lot. And that favour doesn't come because Ezra was particularly skilled or particularly knowledgeable or particularly competent, although he was all of those things. His favour came from the fact that he was passionate about God and about the scriptures. That was his priority. That's the thing that he most sought after, to understand the scriptures and then to teach it and to do it, as it says in the NRSV translation. But even Ezra coming back with all that skill, with all that favour of God, with the hand of the Lord upon him, as it says, he couldn't come back and do that on his own, but he brought a team with him, a team of Levites, priests, musicians, gatekeepers, temple servants. And that's a lesson for us, that we don't need to just rely on our ministers, those who stand at the front of church and preach, those who explain the word of God, but actually we all have a part to play in that. It might be a big part, it might be a small part, it might be a visible part or a part behind the scenes. But actually the teamwork of restoring worship is what matters the most. And our favour comes from whether we are turned to God, whether we have our hearts turned to him or not. So the week after that, we started talking about Ezra chapters 9 and 10. And this is possibly the trickiest and stickiest passage of this particular book. What happens is Ezra, he's trying to preach and teach and restore worship, and that's that sacrificial way of worshipping and the Sabbath that they had in the Old Testament times. And he encounters a bunch of marital unfaithfulness and people who had married foreign wives, essentially. And this passage has, over the years, been used to preach a very xenophobic message about how Israel is the pure master race almost, and that all the foreign nations were to some extent evil or impure. And I really want to emphasize the fact that that is not what the passage is about, or that's not what I believe this passage is about. So during that sermon, I drew on two particular Hebrew words that were there in chapter 9, verses 1 and then verse 2. The Hebrew word toeva, which we sometimes translate as abomination, and then the Hebrew word kodesh, which we often translate as holy. And I think in English we can often understand these words to mean evil and good, respectively. That abomination means something hideous or monstrous, whereas holy means pure and perfect and great. And actually, I think that perhaps a closer translation or understanding of these words are to do with holiness being set apart, being distinct, whereas abomination perhaps referring more to the foreign practices at the time. So what it's saying, I think, is not so much about being pure and perfect as opposed to evil and monstrous, but being distinct and separate rather than conforming to the way the world works. And these marriage laws also hark back to Solomon. A lot of this book does. And Solomon, if you remember, he was the wisest of the kings and the wealthiest and sort of the most powerful, and he ruled over at a time of real unity. But he was led astray by lustfulness. He married hundreds of foreign wives and concubines who ultimately ended up turning his heart away from God. And he set up worship to foreign pagan gods at the time like Asherah, and didn't have his heart fixed on God in the way that the kings were supposed to. And so the same was happening for the Israelite people, that marrying foreign gods wasn't the problem. The problem was them turning their hearts away from God and towards other pagan religions and pagan ways of doing things. And Israel is called to be that holy nation, that nation that isn't perfect but is set apart from the rest of the nations at the time. And that lesson for us that Amos chapter 5 says that God doesn't care about our religious festivals. He despises our religious festivals when actually we're preaching hypocrisy and our hearts are not turned to him fully. And so for Ezra, trying to restore that worship, it was essential to get people's hearts back to God. Not just, it doesn't matter what we do at church or in the temple on Sundays or on Saturdays or Fridays as they did in those days. What matters is turning our hearts back to God, returning to him to worship in spirit and in truth. So around this time, a lot of our churches started having their harvest celebrations, so we had a little bit of a break, which falls nicely for us because we've done 4 weeks on Ezra and now the remaining 6 weeks on Nehemiah. So looking firstly at Nehemiah chapters 1 to 3, and this essentially is the story of Nehemiah himself, who was a cupbearer to the king in Persia, hearing that the walls of Jerusalem had been left battered and destroyed and crumbling, and the city itself lying in ruin. And that idea that he was almost so homesick that he had real passion for his hometown, his home city, the city of his ancestors, and it was important to him to return back to help rebuild that city physically. And he approached the king and he said, "Is it all right, essentially, I go back and rebuild those walls?" And Nehemiah also, he almost becomes the answer to his own prayer. He was crying out to God about the destruction and desolation of the city, and he himself became the answer to that. One thing that I thought was particularly interesting is later on in Nehemiah, you get the sense that he was really this fantastic leader, this powerful authority figure. But actually, when we first find out about him in chapter 1, he's, as I said, a cupbearer to the king. He's basically a servant, a slave. But he's someone that God has inspired to do that work, to lead his people back into that land. And through God, all of us, regardless of our personality types or our social status, we all have a real powerful part to play, and God can do incredible things through us. But one of the interesting tensions that we found is Nehemiah's desire to rebuild that wall. Is that the same desire that God had? You think back to Ezra chapter 1, it was God that inspired King Cyrus to send the people back and to rebuild the temple and rebuild the worship. This really was a desire of Nehemiah's, and there's an interesting parallel in Zechariah chapter 2 that we found, where Zechariah had this vision while they were in exile, and an angel came and said, "Run and tell that young man that Jerusalem will be a city without walls because of the great number of people and animals in it. And I myself will be a wall of fire around it, declares the Lord. and I will be its glory within it. So almost that sense that we don't need these human walls, these human constructions, those walls that are symbols of protection and strength, but actually the people of Israel are called to have God as their protection and their strength. But in spite of all that, because Nehemiah was so focused on God and restoring that wholeheartedly, that the hand of the Lord was upon him and perhaps granted favour to him because of that, and allowed Nehemiah to come back and begin that rebuild process. Again, not on his own, but with the whole nation of Israel rebuilding part of it at a time. And for us, the same thing, that it's not just about one person leading the show, it's about all of us coming together with our hearts turned to God and rebuilding in the way that God has inspired us to. So moving on from that, we began to look at Nehemiah chapters 4 to 7, and some interesting parallels with what happened in Zerubbabel's time when he tried to rebuild the temple. Similar sorts of things were happening when Nehemiah was trying to rebuild the walls of the city. Of course, with 70 years of desolation and destruction, the surrounding nations began to live and inhabit that land, even where the actual walls were in place, as well as the city within those walls. And so now they're trying to rebuild those walls, and essentially that means kicking people out of where they were now living in order to put those structures back in place. And those walls that are supposed to be symbols of protection and strength ended up becoming symbols of division, not only of the people, the surrounding nations, but the people of their land themselves, the Israelites themselves. And remember that division that happened when they tried to rebuild the temple, that even the Israelite people were not permitted to be part of that. And so we again looked at that passage from Zechariah chapter 2 and whether or not we should have walls at all. And if we are to have walls, make sure they are walls of protection and not walls of division. And interestingly, two figures that pop up in those couple of chapters are Tobiah and Sanballat, and they will come into play again later in the story. But essentially the message for us is, when we rebuild, sometimes we like to have things exactly as they used to be. Sometimes we like to have things the way we like them within our walls. It's something that Ian preached. But for us, to make sure that those walls are not dividing walls, but still allows people to come in and to encounter the presence of God as one family, as one church. So the following week, we looked at Nehemiah chapter 5, particularly sort of the first half of that chapter, which is embedded in that chapter 4 to 7, that chunk that we looked at last week about the opposition to people rebuilding the walls and essentially their homes being destroyed in the process. We get this story about people coming to Nehemiah. You remember, was no one particularly special in the early days when he was in Persia, but now became like a great leader of the nation. And people came to him and said, there's so much persecution and oppression going on. There are people selling themselves into slavery, and the Israelite people essentially oppressing their own people. And there are laws in the Torah and the Old Testament laws that allow for slavery to happen, but in a very particular way. Essentially, you work for another family for 6 years or so, and then on the 7th year, not only are you set free, but you are given resources and allowed to rebuild your own lives and your family in that way. And that wasn't happening at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so acknowledging that oppression that's happening within, remember as Ezra tackling the marital laws and getting people's hearts right with God before they could really rebuild that worship properly. Same sort of thing happening here. We're trying to be one unified city in Jerusalem. There's so much persecution and oppression going on at that time that they were unable to do so. But as soon as Nehemiah confronted that, the people acknowledged their guilt, acknowledged their sinfulness, and repented and returned back to God. And that's a lesson for us, that no matter how much we turn astray or we neglect parts of God's law or God's will for us, that we can always return to God and accept His love for us, repent and come back to Him. And another lesson for us in this story, that perhaps we shouldn't get so preoccupied with our own rebuilding, whatever that may be, our own work that we feel like God is calling us to, but we should be there with open eyes, opening our eyes and looking above those walls to see what other work God might be calling us to do in this time, in our own lives, in our own churches. So the week after that, we did a deep dive into Nehemiah chapter 8, particularly looking at verses 1 to 12. And this is after the wall had finally been finished and rebuilt, and the city was now intact. And there was great celebration and dedication on that day, which happened to be the Festival of Trumpets, as it said back in Leviticus chapter 23. But as they celebrated, Ezra himself read from the Old Testament. He read probably the whole of the Torah, 5 whole books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. And in those times, the people hearing that law being read out are suddenly confronted with the amount of guilt and sinfulness that they feel, having messed up on so many of those laws over the whole span of time that they've essentially been a nation. There's one a festival that is mentioned in that chapter, and they said that they hadn't celebrated that festival properly since the time of Joshua, who was the second person after Moses, the person who came directly after Moses. So basically from the start, they hadn't been following all those laws properly. We might think that those 613 laws of the Old Testament are pretty much unachievable for ourselves. But being acknowledged, being confronted with that guilt and that failing took a toll on the people, and they repented, and they mourned, and they wept. But we have in the midst of that chapter that, what I call a fridge magnet verse, the joy of the Lord is our strength. And that idea that it's not about what we do, but our strength comes from the fact that God has immense joy over us. And I particularly draw on that word joy, which is chedva, which isn't the typical Hebrew word for joy, which is simcha. It's a different kind of joy. It's a type of joy that is really kind of a heightened sense of joy, a joy that only God has for us. And that word for joy, that chedva, is only used 2 or 3 times in the whole of the Old Testament as a real sort of special sense of joy that God has for his people. And for us, as we said, we continue to mess up and fail, and we can't really keep that perfect way of life, that standard that perhaps God calls us to. But that's okay, because the joy of the Lord is our strength. Not our joy in the Lord, but the joy of the Lord. The Lord's joy is what gives us strength, even when we're confronted with our own failures. Remember that God has immense joy over us. So in our penultimate week of the Ezra-Nehemiah series, we were looking at Nehemiah's chapters 9 and 10. And chapter 9 is this beautiful prayer that Ezra says, where he essentially tells the whole story of the Old Testament, the Israelite history, and how much God has been really gracious to them and pouring out his love, and always has plans to prosper them. But the people continue to turn away from God, to fall into sinfulness. But then God always responds with love and restores them. But then the people sin again, and you get this pattern of God pouring out his love and the people just failing and sinning. But the people in that time, they acknowledge God's love, and it has another one of those fridge magnet verses in chapter 9, verse 17. You are a forgiving God, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And at the end of that chapter, the people make a binding agreement, a binding covenant, to say that from now on, we're not going to be like that. We are going to turn our hearts back to God properly and restore ourselves back to him as a new covenant, as a new agreement, which again has echoes back to Jeremiah chapters 29 to 31, where God says, I have those plans for you to prosper. I'm going to restore you back to your nation, back to your kingdom in Jerusalem, and I'm going to set a new covenant in your hearts. I'm going to break your hearts of stone and give you hearts turned back to me. So it's a beautiful passage. And again, we just reminded us that the church has got that history as well. Even as a redeemed people and a redeemed nation, the church, though God has been loving and gracious and faithful to us, we have steered away from him. We have used the name of God and the name of Jesus for all sorts of horrible reasons throughout the centuries, and including today, and that we can still continue to repent, turn back to God, remembering that he is a forgiving God, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. So then finally we came to the final week of our series, where we looked at Nehemiah chapters 11 to 13. And 13, which is really sort of the epilogue, the aftermath of what came before the previous 22 chapters of that book of Ezra-Nehemiah. And it drew on the themes that had come out throughout the whole of that book. Firstly, rebuilding the temple, then restoring the worship and the Sabbath, renewing that marital purity, and then rebuilding the walls. So in chapters 9, remember we had that confession, that repentance, recognizing God's love and their unfaithfulness, then returning back to God and creating that new covenant, setting that new covenant in place, turning back to God in that way. Chapter 10 is the reaffirming of that new covenant. Chapter 11, they repopulated the whole city, so it now became this thriving, bustling place filled with love and restoration. And then in chapter 12, they had a huge celebration of this new dedication. And in verse 43, it says, "On that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and children also rejoiced, and the sound of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away." So really, we've had the happy ending to the book, to the whole book. There's this great sense of rededication and God making a new thing, and then finally turning themselves back to God and rededicating themselves. But as we go through chapter 13, we find that that's not the case. Nehemiah had to go back to Persia for a few years as he promised the king. But as he returned back again to Jerusalem, he's wandering around and he's finding that the temple is not being used properly. That actually one of those enemy people in the early days, you remember Tobiah from chapter 4, he was now living in the temple, a place that's supposed to be dedicated just for the priests and for the storehouses and for sacrifice and for worship. A place of prayer had now been infiltrated by one of the enemies, and he was just using it for lodging, just not what it's meant to be. He wanders around again and he notices that the Sabbath is not being respected, and that's integral to the way they do worship. That people were working on the Sabbath, they were leaning up against the walls, not residing within the walls like they should be, so they were disrespecting those brand new walls as well. And again, Nehemiah has to rectify that and tell people that they shouldn't be doing work on the Sabbath. Remember, the Sabbath harks back all the way to the very beginning of Genesis, the creation story, that poem where God creates the world in 6 days, but on the 7th day he broke that pattern and he rested. And that's the pattern that we should be emulating, because God did that pattern himself. And then Ezra continues to walk around, and he notices that people are having mixed marriages. Again, talking about Solomon and how Solomon's heart was poisoned away from God towards those pagan nations through that unfaithful way of his impure marriages. And again, not in a xenophobic way, but in a way that puts God at the centre of everything that we do, including our own marriages. And again, Sanballat from Nehemiah chapter 4, who again was one of those enemies of the walls rebuild. He was an integral part of that. And yet now, that marital faithfulness that they'd got in place only a few years earlier had suddenly fallen apart, even just within a few years. They came back. So that rebuilding the temple, the worship in the Sabbath, the marital purity, and the walls, all within just a few years, had all fallen apart after that great celebration, that great joy, that great rededication. But maybe that's okay. We can look at what happens after the story of Nehemiah, what happens in the next chapter, and we find that's the last chapter of Nehemiah. That's not only the last chapter of Nehemiah, that's the last chapter of the whole of the Old Testament history. All that came after that in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Chronicles, which essentially recaps that story. So we're left not only finishing the book of Nehemiah, but the whole of the sermon series on Ezra-Nehemiah, and from that, the whole of the Old Testament history on this bizarre anti-climax. And this great joy that they had just in chapter 12 is now sort of left hanging, and we're left thinking, what can this mean? For us, we know that the promise is still to come, that promise of Jeremiah, which Ezra mentions in chapter 1, of a new people, a new covenant. It will happen. It takes place maybe 400 years after the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. But it will come to pass. It will come to its fruition, because God is a God that keeps his promises. And for us, we've got Advent coming up, where we talk about the promise and that fulfillment of the Old Testament covenants is coming ever closer to us in the baby Jesus as he grows into adulthood through his death and resurrection. And that's something that we look forward to as Christians, coming to fruition in Advent, starting just next week. So finally we have come to the end of our sermon series on Ezra and Nehemiah. And remember, all the way back at the beginning, that sense of God is rebuilding the church, just like the people were coming back from exile to rebuild the temple, to rebuild their worship. We've come back from an exile in the pandemic to rebuild church and rebuild our worship together. So what can this whole thing mean for us? What have we learned from this? Well, perhaps you could say that Ezra and Nehemiah is a book of disappointment. It's not a book with a happy ending like perhaps we prefer our stories to be. It always starts promisingly with unity and with high expectations and optimism. But ultimately it has those dips of division, disunity and arguments and disruption to that. And perhaps a lesson for us in that is that the people of Ezra and Nehemiah's time, they had too much trust and reliance in human strength to be able to complete these things, to be able to fulfill all these things. That we can't do this in our own strength. We need to rely on God to provide that strength for us. And if we rely too much on humanity, on our church leaders, then ultimately we're probably going to succumb to that same fate that Ezra and Nehemiah had in those days, that just within a few years, those good intentions can fall down, and that we can succumb to sin just as they did back in those days. But instead, we trust in God, we listen for His voice, we make room for Him, and more importantly, we keep that unity together, that although we come from different places, we have different backgrounds, we have different theologies, different understandings of God, of church, that actually we are one church and we keep that unity because Jesus is at the centre of all that we do. So for us, just as they did in Ezra and Nehemiah's time, we still play our part. We don't expect God to magically make everything fine without us having involvement. And actually we're privileged to be able to participate in that with Him. But we rely on God to guide us in all of that, and we try our best as one church to keep in step with Him. One thing that I've really felt God saying for us as a church in Drumfield, two key words for us are intimacy and inclusion. In everything that we're doing with church and rebuilding, it's important to be intimate with God, know that He is intimate with us, He knows us deeply, and we should get to know Him deeply too. But inclusion, as in part of God's plan, participating with Him in how He wants to rebuild church for us and with us now. And then that intimacy inclusion, not just with God, but with one another, that as one body, as one church, we should be intimate with one another and include one another and provide that safe space for the community to come. Be intimate with the community, include them, and remember that we are all called to be a part of God's incredible work, God's incredible kingdom. And what a privilege it is to be able to participate in that. More importantly than all of that, we trust God to guide us, to lead us. And as one unified church, we try to keep in step with Him, constantly listening for His voice, constantly hearing His guidance and trying to keep in step with Him. Remembering that Jesus is coming again, yes, in Advent next week, but the second coming of Christ, where He will restore all things and rebuild that heavenly kingdom with Him and God on the throne, surrounded in the power of the Spirit as one church, as one kingdom, with Jesus and God at the centre of it all. So Ezra and Nehemiah may have ended in disappointment, but we still have that hope that God will restore all things with Him at the centre, and we have the privilege of participating in that.